Perfect, and welcome to our third and final installment in our Ask the Author series for RIT 7035. This week I spoke with Professor Huiling Ding, who is Professor of Technical Communication at North Carolina State University in Raleigh, North Carolina. Her research investigates transcultural communication, health communication, and digital communication. Her book, Rhetoric of a Global Epidemic, won the National Council of Teachers of English's Best Book in Technical Communication Award in 2016. The book investigated transcultural communication about the SARS pandemic. So, of course, she currently has stuff in the works on COVID. We hear a bit about that today. She also investigates how we can communicate about health and risk effectively across cultures, and how we can best develop locally specific, ethical, and effective interventions in community health practices. In addition, she's working on artificial intelligence and the way that artificial intelligence operates in professional communication practices. In this video, we talked about the role of digital media and social media in conveying health information, the importance of paying attention to local contexts in order to create effective interventions, and what we see as potential futures of the field since we are wrapping up our semester here. I hope you get a lot out of this video. It was a very enjoyable interview with obviously very immediate and practical application. Enjoy. So, Professor Ding, first of all, let me thank you for making the time to talk with students here at the University of Queensland today. Um,
You're most
I want to
welcome.
start. I want to start by asking you about a piece in the introduction to this article. So you mentioned there that you were one of only two experts who are emphasizing low tech and locally appropriate interventions. In your book, Rhetoric of a Global Epidemic, you also discuss how successful those locally appropriate communication practices were with SARS. And in Australia, we've seen the success of those community-led responses in our Indigenous communities as well. Can you tell us why paying attention to those local contexts matters so much with these transnational epidemics like Zika, SARS, and COVID?
Yeah, sure. So I see one of your students asked who the other person is, so I can start there. So
Sure.
the other person was actually a professor of public health
Mhm.
who worked with marginalized communities in the US. So he personally knew the impacts of socioeconomic conditions on health outcomes and how health disparity is real, right, everywhere. In terms of coming up with culturally appropriate measures to cope with diseases, I think we really need to think about how different cultures, different nation states have not only different material conditions, right, socioeconomic limits, infrastructures, but also values, preferences, and customs when it comes to healthcare. So, for instance, when we talk about Zika, right, or mosquito-borne disease, it is, you know, to someone in the US, it may not even occur to them that mosquito repellent is not affordable in a lot of poor communities. So when I was doing the study um, on Zika in South America, it was quickly really clear to me that the women, right, and the low-income communities affected by the outbreak, they were actually really living under the poverty line, so they won't be able to afford mosquito spray, for instance. And then if we talk about COVID-19, um, the most important protection against COVID-19 would be personal, right, protective equipment such as masks, having access to tap water, right, to all those expensive things to people living in poverty. So I am wondering, how do we talk about PPE, right, and hand washing and sanitizer to kids to elderly and to the marginalized populations who may never have access to those things. And what does prevention look like in those settings? So I don't have first-hand experiences with those, extremely poor communities in the US. But here in North Carolina, we have a really unique problem when the schools got shut down,
Mm-hmm.
because all the schools provide free lunch or reduced lunch programs to children from lower income families. And when the school got shut down, the school buses were not in operation either. And then when the school offered free or reduced lunch on site and asked parents to drive to school to pick up those lunch boxes, and they quickly found out some of the families had no access to transportation. They don't have personal vehicles, right? So that's another way to show, even within one state, a pretty industrialized state in the U.S., we still have health disparities and lack of access to a lot of the things that we take for granted. So if we think about the type of problems we faced internationally, I can't imagine how maybe a large proportion of people most affected by outbreaks will not have access to all the things that we in the developed countries take for granted. So it is really important to think about intervention in a local setting, working with people to use whatever they have, right, to defend themselves against epidemics.
I think that point about westernized and highly developed countries is so interesting as well. Because just this morning,
Mhm.
it's only 7 a.m. here, but earlier this morning, I was seeing a piece out of New Zealand talking about why it was so imperative that they responded so quickly to COVID-19, because they have such massive disparities in health outcomes between their Maori
Mhm.
and Pakeha populations, that had they not,
Mhm.
it would have been truly devastating, in the
Yeah,
same way that we're seeing play out in the United States at the moment.
right,
Yeah.
definitely.
Mm. All right. So our second question here is about local governments, which can at
Mhm.
times be a hindrance in pandemic response. You note the Hong Kong government's response to SARS in your conclusion to the Zika article. And
Mhm.
now, again with COVID, obviously preying on everyone's minds, governments can and have ignored expert advice, downplayed the severity of the pandemic, delayed potentially life saving measures. This in turn
Mhm.
affects the way that populations respond, their beliefs, their opinions, their compliance. How can crowdsourcing and participatory response help to address these problems?
That's a great question. I mean, we've seen how government basically failed to respond to COVID-19, especially in the US, right?
Mhm.
So basically, experts were, you know, labeled as disseminating over-exaggerated information, so on and so forth. And that really has devastating impacts on local community responses, because who do you listen to, right? Do you listen to scientists, CDC, right, health experts, or do you listen to political figures, right? When the political figures and the medical experts voice different opinions and they argue against each other in terms of the severity of the outbreak and possible ways to defend oneself against the virus, the public can be really, really confused, right? And we see that and how that may influence how the outbreak eventually develop in any country. So I think all the students in your class, they are definitely well informed. And one thing that we can do as citizen scientists, right, is to work along with what is called career scientist. I just saw the term. I was like, this makes so much sense, right?
Yeah.
So career scientists versus citizen scientists, right? If we educate ourselves about possible ways to provide productive, meaningful, and useful local intervention, um, I think it is our call, it is our responsibility, right, to do fact checking, to offer efforts to dispel the myth, right, the misinformation, and to promote community responses at a local level. Maybe it's at a school, maybe it's at a graduate program, maybe it is in your neighborhood, right? How do we launch those public education, right, misinformation dispelling efforts as a community? How do we volunteer for community initiated projects? How do we help people around us? It can be very small scale in terms of crowdsourcing, right? And then with a lot of this grassroots intervention, hopefully we will gain some voice. We will develop a voice that can be more trustworthy, that can influence more people. So what I worked on in a forthcoming project on smart crowdsourcing and Wuhan mobility. So Wuhan was the city that was the first epicenter in China that got locked down right before the Chinese New Year. And when the city got locked down, all the public transportation services were stopped and people couldn't go anywhere that's outside that 2 miles, right, distance. So taxi drivers, people with private cars, right, they actually volunteered and worked together to assist with mobility, especially for medical care workers, right, for doctors and nurses who work with COVID-19 patients, both suspected and diagnosed patients. It was a very difficult project, and people worked together as volunteers, as communities, to make sure, patients could still get to the hospital, and medical care workers wouldn't have to walk or ride a bike for 4 hours back and forth every day just to go to work to cure patients. So I think as citizen scientists, as concerned citizens, we can work out something to influence people around us, to help them to cope better with the outbreak, and together we can reduce the size, right, the impacts of the outbreak in a local setting.
We had Liz Hutchinson Compos come in last week, and we talked a lot about our obligations within our community and how we can
Mm,
understand our communities as working together to create
yeah,
change in those ways. And this really resonates with their work as well.
great.
Okay, members of the GovLab panel proposed social media digital listening to assess the Zika outbreak. We've, of course, seen immense misinformation about public health circulating widely on social media, even this week. Was this a concern at that time and in that context? And what can we as technical and professional communication practitioners, what role can we play in assessing and talking about health information online?
Mhm. So in any outbreak, misperceptions, misinformation, or culturally specific myth, right, can be disseminated either via word of mouth or today, right, through social media. So I would say misinformation is not a new thing, but the social media definitely help to greatly accelerate how it gets disseminated to a much wider audience. So for us as technical and professional communicators, I think what is really important is okay, to emphasize quality control, right, in the information evaluation process. So for instance, if you, right, if your students teach any writing classes, we can talk about, quality control, making sure you have the best evidence possible that you can use to back up your claim. So I've been participating in a smart crowdsourcing um, campaign related to asking a scientist about COVID-19. And it was a really interesting project, again, initiated by GovLab. And they worked with a National Scientists Association to initiate the entire process. So what we've been saying as the key measure is whenever you answer any questions, and by the way, we have a wide variety of questions, including, realistic ones, really urgent ones coming from patients with terminal illnesses who have to go to hospitals, who worry about contracting COVID-19, right? So those are really important questions to them and to us as well. So the quality control process is basically this. Before you offer any, responses, make sure you have credible sources, most preferably from scientific publications, right? Scientists who publish about latest findings about the virus and the transmission, right? Vaccination, and so on and so forth. So having quality control and making quality control or fact checking, right? Essential part of the information creation, sharing, and disseminating processes. I think it's really important, especially for us who want to educate the public and say, hey, this is not true, that is not true, this is partially true, and here's why, and here are the sources that you can check. And then so I think this is a typical role that technical and professional communicators play, right? We connect the experts with the public. And in that process, what we try to do is to make our responses really accessible. When we say accessible, we're talking about maybe the reading, right, the vocabulary and reading level that's appropriate for maybe eighth, ninth graders.
Mm-hmm.
So really, how do you write clear, crystal clear, and accessible, and still understandable, right? Messages about COVID-19, about prevention, about transmission, so that you can make a difference in your own community and in whatever type of intervention we can offer to help to combat the outbreak in a local setting, in a national setting, right? Depending on what kind of platform we are talking about.
Uh, this hooks very beautifully into our next question. So, students asked about technical language, jargon, plain English, and cultural context. And they gave the example of the term social distancing, which emerged very early as a key term with COVID. Here, we had an unsuccessful push for people to say physical distancing instead to, remind us to remain socially engaged. Once language settles in this way, is there less need for us to change up our language to explain processes and policy in those culturally specific, literacy appropriate ways? Like, at what point does this stop being jargon and start becoming the most accessible way to talk about something?
I think that's a really interesting example that you gave, social distancing versus physical distancing. And I think we had the same thing here in the US. The term physical distancing failed to really pick up, right? So it got dropped, and then we still regularly use social distancing. What we can do is to really emphasize, even though the new term, right, the new way to say things may not get adopted, but we can call attention to the signs that are missing in the original term, right? And come up with new and creative ways to call attention to those signs. So for instance, I'm sure you've been going through the same thing in New Zealand and here. So what we have is, when everyone moved online, right, in terms of the virtual academy in K-12 settings or for college students to work from home. So we found their personal touch, right, their interaction to be missing. And then the question became not, what's missing from social distancing, right, when we can practice physical distancing. And we can change that question to say, how do we make social distancing more social, right? More communal. What can we add to those virtual meetings? What can we do to help students who feel isolated, right? What can we do to help boost the mental health and physical health of colleagues who work from home, I don't know, like 24 hours a day, right? Whose working hours, I'm sure you all experience the same thing, become longer,
Mm-hmm.
right? The productivity may drop, right? Even though we don't commute now. So calling attention to the new problems, find a way to frame that, and then to add, I think especially for the term, right, physical distancing versus social distancing, how do we add human touch and compassion into our virtual interaction, right? Those are important questions. We can probably be more creative about and call attention to possible ways to address things that are missing in the terms that are currently being used.
Yeah, and then to keep using those terms because they are the ones that
Yeah,
people understand, right? They're using
yeah,
them. So, if
yeah,
we just throw them out immediately, we lose that ability to quickly communicate those key ideas as well. Yeah.
exactly.
Okay. So we are coming to the very end of our semester down here and wrapping up a survey of technical and professional communication. So in this last week of class, we are talking about what next? What are the future directions of the field? Can you tell us what you think are the most exciting trends in technical communication?
Definitely. I think if we talk about COVID-19, the thing that immediately comes to mind is we can never work alone, right? In this world, especially we have a pandemic that's going on. If you follow what's going on in the labor market, automation has been accelerating, right? People's jobs may be permanently lost. So we have all kinds of complicated, quickly evolving technologies and societal landscape. So I think what is really important is to really build a multidisciplinary and slash interdisciplinary perspective of your work, right? What can we do to collaborate with, you know, experts, right? Subject matter experts, medical experts, or I don't know, um, computer scientists or AI specialists, right? So that we can help to develop language technologies, communication technologies that have some ethical considerations taken, um, you know, I mean, some of those considerations will be incorporated in the design process, right? Or at least, how do we evaluate those technologies that are already in use and call attention to unexpected impacts, negative outcomes because of the lack of consideration of users or ethical impacts of those technologies. So definitely, be interdisciplinary, reach out, collaborate with other disciplines to see how communication technologies are changing, how they are being designed, and how they have been influencing us with all those black box right? Black box technologies, especially in terms of AI and machine learning. And also, we should definitely go back to the issues of usability, user-centered design, social justice, ethical design, and accessibility. All those important things that we've been emphasizing as a field.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've already mentioned you have a piece coming out soon or under review about the lockdowns in Wuhan. What else are you working on? What can we look forward to seeing from you?
So I've been working on two different types of projects. I got a National Science Foundation that look at artificial intelligence and workforce development and upskilling. So in that project, I've been working with multiple graduate students to look at communication technologies, especially recruiting technologies such as applicant tracking systems, video interviews, neuroscience games, and LinkedIn optimization. How all those technologies totally transform how recruiting and job interviews and screening have been done and will be done um, in a global setting. So that's one group of project I've been working on, and we are in the process of writing research articles on those topics. And then another project that I've been focusing on more this semester is COVID-19. So crowdsourcing has been a topic that's really fascinating to me. And I think it makes total sense because of my interest in grassroots intervention and participatory risk communication. I see crowdsourcing as a way to really organize concerned citizens to take meaningful and productive action to influence how risks are or can be managed and communicated at local, regional, national, or even international settings. So the Wuhan Mobility Project is a pretty short article. It's forthcoming, and then I'm looking at e-health, or basically how China offered free online consultation to concerned citizens, close contacts of COVID-19 patients, and patients with chronic conditions when it was impossible for them to go to hospitals with a lot of COVID-19 cases for any medical consultation. So I've been looking at that type of smart crowdsourcing and how medical care workers really collaborate with professional organizations, big tech companies, AI technologies, 5G, to really provide a national, basically a national solution to people who couldn't go to the hospital because of COVID-19. So that was a really interesting project for me.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time to work through these questions. I've certainly gotten a lot out of just listening, and I know it's going to seed a fantastic discussion when we meet in class next week. So I really appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Thank you. Thank you for taking the time. And I'd like to thank your students for sending all those thoughtful questions. I really enjoy thinking through them. That gave me some time to think about as well. So thank you.